You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, great to be back alongside you.
It's great to be back alongside you, Eugene Perrier. We have a great show today, huh?
I think we do have a great show today. A lot of different pieces, as everyone can always imagine. We'll be discussing everything from the global economy, where it's going, the anti-racist pushback, to the rise of sort of racist pogromish type activity there in Britain and the United Kingdom, the role of AIPAC and various other right-wingers involved in the political arena here in the United States. Obviously, we'll continue to discuss other issues related to the ongoing genocide in Gaza, possible regional expansion. More on the issue of Venezuela, the election, the aftermath, where a lot has been happening, especially today. We'll touch a little bit on Bangladesh. I think we've got some clips of Kamala Harris. So there's a whole range of things that are out there that we have to bring you here, which is a good time to remind you, if you are watching on YouTube, to go ahead and hit subscribe. Then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, so that all the excellent content, like Dispatches with Rania Khalek, will be easy for you to find, to watch, enjoy, and share. So yes, YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get the things you subscribe to. And shout out to everybody watching here on Free Speech TV. You don't have to do anything, but keep watching on Free Speech TV. By the way, Breakthrough News, Free Speech TV, and ACT TV will be doing a special set of programming on the 21st and the 22nd of August in relationship to the Democratic National Convention. So more on that to come, but everyone at FSTV saluting you for making it possible to appear on your platform here on the Freedom Side. Rania, are there other things you would like for our viewers to be aware of?
Yes, there are. I want to remind everybody who is watching to make sure you've smashed that like button, you guys. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Like button. There we go. John got it right this week. Thank you. No fumble by any of us so far.
Good.
But moreover, I want to encourage those who are watching to, if you aren't already a member, please do become, if you are able to, a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Becoming a member is super important if you're able to, because it helps sustain us and helps keep us growing in this ocean of corporate-funded propaganda that's relentlessly shoved in our faces as we get ever closer to this presidential election. It's a breath of fresh air to have independent media that is here to bring you the truth and actually speak about the reality that's taking place, calling a genocide a genocide. And we have a lot to say about that on this program today, but really I do encourage you, patreon.com/Breakthrough News. On top of helping support independent media, you can also access exclusive content and some pretty cool exclusive merch.
Yeah, like this mug.
Which I don't have right now because my mug is in my studio in Lebanon at the moment, where I will be back to soon.
Well, I'm glad it's like a clean mug. You're not doing any sort of product placements out here. Very, very glad to see that you're keeping your
actually,
your anti-corporate.
I won't show you the other side, but it's actually my sister's mug, and it says the university one of her kids goes to, and then mom on it.
Oh, well, that's nice. That's very nice.
It's sweet. It's sweet.
Yes.
But I'm not going to promote the university, so I have chosen to keep the clean side in the frame.
Perfect. I appreciate that. I don't know which one it is, so I would hate to be poorly surprised by a university I hate. But
Wow.
I have strong opinions on colleges and universities. But that being said, many great ones out there. But that being said, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Let's just move on here then. I was going to say something else, but I lost it. Whatever it was.
All those universities he hates.
Yeah, whatever it wasn't that important since I lost it there. But let's go ahead and move into our first story, which is something that, it's been making a lot of headlines that maybe people have seen, this rise of right-wing activity, racist activity in Britain. And then also now we've seen over the past couple of days a very significant pushback starting to come from anti-racist there in the UK. So to get into all of what's happening, we are very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Roger McKenzie, who is the international editor of the Morning Star newspaper, a longtime anti-racist organizer himself, and also an executive committee member of the Communist Party of Britain. Roger, thank you so much for being back with us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you here, because sorting through all this is important. We're just getting a lot of, headlines, but not a lot of substance. I mean, maybe just give us a sense to start here. I mean, how did this start that these sort of mobs of racists started coming out into the street? What was going on that has kicked them up in this way?
Well, first thing to say is that I actually can't see you, Eugene, so I'm going to treat this as radio, basically. I don't know what's going on, but that's
well,
fine.
you look great.
Yeah, we can see you. We can see you. So
I'm on my holidays, so it's fine. It's fine. Well, the first thing is that 3 young girls got killed by a young boy, by the sounds of it. And the first thing I really want to say is to offer condolences to the family, for the families of the 3 young girls who got killed. And none of that should ever be politicized, the fact that people got killed. But the far right did. They decided that the boy who carried out these what he's alleged to have carried out the killings was an immigrant. And they decided to spread that lie around the internet that the guy was an immigrant, that he was a Muslim, when in fact he wasn't an immigrant at all. Yes, he was a Muslim, but he was born and brought up in Wales. Now, this killing took place in Southport, but the far right used a load of Telegram channels to start spreading misinformation around, and soon turned out basically mobs into Southport, where this killing took place, and ransacked a mosque. Now, the really good thing that in terms of response, because the response didn't take a week or even a few days to take place, the response to that ransacking of the mosque took place immediately by people in the local community condemning the far right for their actions, and actually within 24 hours rebuilding the damage that had been done. So black and white people coming together and rebuilding the damage that had been done to that mosque. So then immediately the anti-racist forces got together and stood up and started organising against the racists. But the racists decided that they were going to spread these riots, because that's what they were, across the country. They also decided that they were going to attack any lone black person that was walking down any street where they decided that they were going to mobilise and attempt to beat them up. And that's what they did in a number of places who had nothing to do with Southport. So places hundreds of miles away, in places like Middlesbrough, which is in the northeast of the country, in Manchester, long-time black community, long-time mixed community in a place like Manchester, but also in places like Belfast in Northern Ireland as well. They decided that they were going to march down the streets of Belfast and ransack any shop or any cafe or any home that looked like it had anything to do with any black person. The thing that I want to say in terms of a context for this, just to finish this bit, is that what we are seeing is immigration and refugee and asylum seeking being used as code. And it's a code for blackness. It's a code that says if you are black, then you are an immigrant, you are a refugee, you are an asylum seeker. And there's plenty of politicians from right the way across the so-called the mainstream political spectrum in Britain who are complicit in this, because they've been stoking up racism for years. They've been playing the race card because they think that it'll either do them no damage, or they're doing it because they think it will give them a plus point. So people in the governing Labour Party, people in the Conservative Party have been complicit in this. But what we've seen is that we've seen people standing up and organising and not prepared to see their communities taken over by the far right, and are uniting together. And I think that's, out of all of this, that is something that's been good to see.
You know, I want you to elaborate a bit on the sort of political atmosphere that's created a climate where we see this sort of thing happening in the streets. I appreciate that you mentioned that, because a lot of the way this has been covered in the mainstream media that's given it attention is it's one of two ways. It's either there's just kind of these random mobs, it's really random, yeah, it's like racist, but, and it's, you know, or there's this other way of kind of just blaming it on the far right only, and mentioning far right figures like Tommy Robinson, and it's not to, you know, absolve them of responsibility. Of course, those people are responsible. However, there is a political climate that has led to the normalization of this sort of racism and hate directed at people who are darker and are perceived to basically not belong in the UK. And so I'm curious if you can speak a bit to that in terms of both Labour and the Tories, because it's not just the Tories here. It's not just these far right figures. And then also, maybe to add to that a bit, I'm just curious, and you can tell me if this is a stretch, has the genocide in Gaza and the sort of atmosphere around that contributed at all to some of this racism?
Yeah, happy to talk about those. I think, I mean, when you look at the Labour Party, I mean, the easiest thing I can do is refer everybody to a piece that I've written in the Morning Star newspaper today, which is a feature that goes to some of this. And some of the key points that I make in that are really that this is years in the making. That these things don't just happen overnight. It's not just a spark and, you know, something happens. These things build up. And one of the things I talk about in this article is the way that the militarism that Britain is complicit in, the years of austerity that Britain is involved in, but also imperialism that Britain is, you know, one of the foremost advocates, foremost countries that's involved in. When you add all those things together, what they actually do is that they create a whole picture. It's a zero-sum game, really, that says some people are benefiting at the expense of somebody else. Essentially, it's saying that people, you know, the darker people are benefiting to at the expense of white people. So when a bunch of white people who've got nothing, listening to those sorts of things from the mainstream parties, and you're right, Rania, we hear that from the Labour Party and we hear it from the Conservative Party. In fact, just before the elections, what we heard was Keir Starmer, now the Prime Minister, saying things like the Bangladeshis should be made to leave. Right. Years before that, we had the Labour Party in one election producing. You were talking earlier on about the mug that you're using. You know, I mean, we had the Labour Party had its own mug that says "End immigration." You know, or stop immigration. We have Labour buying into the whole thing about stop the boats, which essentially is about migrants trying to get across from France, across the English Channel to Britain to escape a war that Britain's been part of or helped to start or whatever. So this is not stuff that's new. This is stuff that's all been created, this whole atmosphere, this whole language that basically says that, number one, black people, you are not really British. Number one. Secondly, black people, you are to blame for all the ills in this country, will ignore the fact that there are more than 3 million millionaires in a country of 70 million in Britain, will ignore that for the moment and will say a few thousand people who are crossing the English Channel to try and get a better life, that it's their fault. And what we'll do is we'll say all of these people who are trying to worship their religion, minding their own business, it's their fault as well. And we'll stoke all this up because we think that we'll get some political capital out of it. And of course, what we know, Rania and Eugene, is that we know that this isn't just a British phenomenon. We know this is an international phenomenon, which is why the point about imperialism is really, really important, because it's an international kind of view that we have to take about this. Because you have it with Trump, you have it with the Democratic Party as well, about the way that they play the race card, without even blinking. Over the channel from Britain, we have France, where, as I understand it, Macron was hoping to have a national rally, so the fascist and Marine Le Pen's party win the elections, because he hoped that what was going to happen was that the French people would see how bad this was and, in the area of their ways, vote in another neoliberal term for Macron's coalition. So we know that that sort of thing's happening. And what we have to do, and I'm really, really pleased what we're seeing at the minute, is that we're seeing working class people, black and white, coming together and defending their communities. But more than that, I think it sends a really important message out there that says, more than we're just defending something, it's a positive message of working class unity, because I firmly believe we cannot trust politicians to deal with this stuff. We certainly can't trust the police to deal with this stuff. Everything that we've ever seen tells us we can't trust either of those two groups, whatever party they might be. And the only people who ever going to make any difference in terms of bringing about a better society in any kind of way and stamping out racism are when working class people unite together. And I'm really pleased that we're seeing people come out in massive numbers across the country, many places where they haven't done that before. But I think this feeds back to the last point that you made, Rania, about Gaza. Because people, I think, are linking this stuff to the fact that we've seen hundreds of thousands of people coming out on the streets actually every week in Britain protesting about the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, and I don't think it's lost on people about the absolutely dreadful, incredibly, just awful, horrific treatment that's being meted out against the Palestinians. And they can see that it doesn't take much to look at some of the comments that Starmer makes, for example, where he finds it really easy to talk about anti-Semitism, and he should talk about anti-Semitism. But for some reason, he cannot bring himself to say that word, Islamophobia. He can't do it. And he's had so many chances to do it that he just won't, because he sees a difference as well. And by the way, this is somebody who can't deal with the racism within his own party that an official report that his party called for by an eminent lawyer. He still hasn't dealt with that racism, so who's going to have confidence for him to deal with anything, frankly? The only people we should have confidence in is each other as working class people to stand up against racism.
No, I think that's very well put point, and I think it's very interesting to see the swiftness with which there is a growth of an anti-racist fight back coming forward. And I know there's more coming up with calls for big marches this Saturday as well by Stand Up to Racism. Well, Roger, as always, we really appreciate you having with us. Thanks for interrupting your holiday to give us this important context on a critically important set of events.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Eugene, after these race riots started a couple of days into them, I think there was a few countries that I think up to 4 countries were warning their citizens against travel to the UK. And a friend of mine who has a British passport but was in Lebanon messaged me and was like, so I don't know where I'm supposed to go. Cause like all these embassies are like, leave Lebanon immediately. And now all of these countries are saying not to go to the UK. And I'm just like, what a world we live in, huh? Like,
I know. I think
what a
Lebanon was
disaster.
actually one of the countries that sent a warning. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I know
Yeah.
Nigeria was one.
I think yeah, Nigeria was definitely one. It might have been Lebanon. Either way, it was a bit comical. I mean, none of this is comical. It's very awful what's happening, but you know, some dark humor in there, but also something to be said about the stability of some of these, you know, supposed civilized countries in the global north.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is something to be seen. I mean, it's been some time. Obviously, it's not totally new in the UK, which has a long history of racism and colonialism. But to see this kind of brazenness, I think is the thing. It just kind of caught my eye. I mean, it's not that it's the first time, of course, but again, to just see it. And, you know, it just shows how these things are also linked, too, when we think about the point you made about Gaza, nationalism, the history of colonialism, how it is today. Because just prior to this happening, you know, you had this big rally, so-called patriotism rally that took place in London. But it was really, you know, this Tommy Robinson-led sort of racist event, you know, but bringing tens of thousands of people into London under the guise of patriotism, but really using that to smuggle in this hatred of immigrants and others and so on and so forth. So you can see the permutations here of how it's all coming together. I mean, it really is quite the situation. But yeah, the videos and photos from yesterday of like tens of thousands of people, I think 25,000 people in one area, either in London or close to London, is pretty notable. And certainly people have been coming out and defending their community. So I suspect on Saturday we'll see some pretty big events. And of course, we will keep following that for all of you and bring you everything that seems relevant here. But we want to turn to our next story here, which is the state of the economy. You know, it's to some degree kicked off by the story that happened here in the United States earlier in the week. I guess it was Monday when there was a major Wall Street sell-off. A lot of conversation, not just about the U.S. economy, but the world economy, the possibility of a, you know, quote-unquote recession, economic slowdown, you know, economic collapse. Some people saying it's great and everything's going perfect. So to sort through all of that, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Michael Roberts, who's a socialist economist and author of numerous books on the world economy and has a great blog called The Next Recession you can check out. Michael, thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be here for the first time on your show. I appreciate you inviting me.
No, of course. Very, very happy to have you. And I guess I'll just start with what took place on Monday with the big Wall Street sell-off in the morning. I guess maybe my question is this a canary in the coal mine of some deeper challenges in the economy, or is it just a blip, as it were?
Well, you could probably argue neither. In a way, it's in between. I think what we've got here is what triggered this big drop in the US market, but also in all the stock markets around the world, about 10% in the US market over the two or 3 days. Japan, nearly 30% fall, and Europe, big falls as well. What triggered that off first of all was the news that of the jobs figures that came out of the US last Friday, which appeared to be much weaker than expected. Unemployment was going to be up by several points, something like 4.3% now unemployment on the official rate. If you look at people who can't get a job, who are not actually on that register, we're talking more about 8%. And there are many other people probably who want jobs who are not being registered. So unemployment appeared to be rising against being told by the official authorities, the government, the administration in the US, and also the Federal Reserve. And just before that, the Federal Reserve said that the economy was too strong, inflation was still too high, and they weren't prepared to cut interest rates. What does that matter? Well, if you're a mortgage holder in the US, you're paying something like nearly 7% on average now for your mortgage. Without reducing the interest rates, that's really hitting into people's living standards. We've had an inflation boost since COVID of something like 25% for the average American household. That's a real hit to living standards. And yet we have the Federal Reserve not prepared to reduce the burden of borrowing costs for households and for small businesses because they claim the economy was too strong. And then we got the news on Friday that it wasn't so strong after all. And there was a real danger that it would go down. The other factor actually also, Eugene, was the real evidence that the huge, great tech bubble that we've had with the so-called Magnificent Seven, top 7 tech companies in the US are making huge profits, having their stock market rise really high, all on the basis of expecting artificial intelligence to deliver massive new gains for these companies. And now the evidence is beginning to show that it's not really having that much impact. They're spending a lot of money on this and they're not getting the return. So profits may well start to call the check over the next few months when we begin to see the earnings figures from these companies are not really so good, not matching expectations. All those factors coming together started to change the expectations of investors in the stock markets. Just to add one more point, though, most of us don't have any stocks.
Right.
So this is really just a load of very better off people in America and Europe and Japan who have decided they don't want to go and invest much in the stock market. The rest of us who really don't have many stock market investments, unless it's through their pensions and they don't have any control over that, may seem that it's upon them. And in a sense, it doesn't. But what it tells you is inflation is still not coming down fast enough. Growth rates are beginning to slow in the US and elsewhere. Really, the US is the best performing economy of the major economies, and it's only growing at about 2%. Europe's not growing at all. Japan's not growing at all. Australia's not growing at all. And also we have the increase now in unemployment in the US. Bringing those things together tells you that the situation going forward over the next year for the average household in America and Europe and elsewhere is not nearly as good as the officials claim it is.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because when it comes to the way that situations like this are dealt with in these capitalist countries, it's usually displaced onto workers. So right now, yes, a lot of people in the US don't have stocks, except for, like you mentioned, pensions or retirement funds. They're not necessarily immediately impacted by what's currently taking place. However, how might this in the coming months and the coming year play out towards workers? Because we do hear almost every single time there's a problem in the stock market, you'll have people like Larry Summers get on television and, say things like, well, unemployment's just going to have to go up and people's wages are just going to have to go down. So, yeah, I'm curious, what can workers under a system like this expect in the near future?
Well, for the average person, what does the stock market tell you? It tells you who've got all the money. The people who are making all the investments are no longer very confident about what's going to happen to the future of the economy, in particular, what's going to happen to their profits. And the way I look at the economy, the capitalist economies, the major economies, is they run on whether the profits are coming to the people who own capital, own the industries, own the finance, own the banks. If their profits begin to decline, then what are they going to do? What they're going to do is they're going to start investing less. They're going to start employing less. They might even at a certain point start laying people off, and we're beginning to see an increase in unemployment, as I said. So that's the risk. The stock markets tell you that the people who run this, run America, who run Britain, who run Europe, who run Japan, who own the capital in those countries, are no longer confident about the success of their economies, and they're beginning to get out of it. So we've seen some of the big investors in the US, like Warren Buffett, sold a large proportion of his shares just before this decline. So did the CEO of Intel, which has now announced it's going to sack 50% of its workers over the next few years because it's not making enough profits and it's struggling. That's an indication of the turn in the economy in the US and elsewhere that's taking place and will take place over the next year or so. Will that mean a slump? Will it mean a recession like we saw in the 2008-9 global financial crash or in the COVID pandemic in 2020? Well, it's too early to say, but clearly we're not going forward at a wonderfully with inflation coming down and growth coming back and everybody getting better off. On the contrary, what this tells you about this correction in the stock market is that the owners of capital are not confident that's going to happen. They're now much more worried that we'll have the alternative of a downturn in the major economies.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the issue of profits, and on the Next Recession blog, you point this out quite a bit, that over the past several decades, we've seen this secular decline in profits. And it feels like that's, one of the most important factors for people, especially working class people, to understand that, in many ways, this seems to speak to, the very issues with capitalism and why we need socialism, because the own fundamentals of the system are sort of predicated on creating these crises.
Well, you're right, Eugene. I think what I've argued, I think those of us who analyze a capitalist economy, it's very simple. If viewers think about it, what drives capitalist companies to invest and employ people? Only if they make a profit. They don't do it because of the goodness of their hearts. They don't do it because they want to produce things. They only produce things if they make a profit. And that's the key contradiction in a capitalist economy. It's not producing things that we need, whether it's social services, transport, housing, education, all the other things that we need to make our lives work. They don't produce them just so that we meet our needs. They only produce them if they make a profit. So the profitability for the owners of capital is key in an economy. And over a long-term period, that profitability tends to decline. It could take some decades to decline, but it does so over periods. And then it leads to a major slump when the profits fall, and you get a series of slumps. Just to tell the viewers, the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is an established American official company, measures the number of slumps or recessions, that's downturns in production and rises in unemployment, over the last 150 years. And we've had, would you believe it, 72 slumps over that period, normally between 8 to 10 years in apart. The last one we had was the pandemic one of 2020. The one before that was the 2009 slump in all the major economies, and they were very big ones. The Great Recession, it was called, in 2009. So there's every reason to expect before the end of this decade, we are going to have another big slump. And the gains that workers made, limited gains that they make in the next few years, could be just swept away as capitalism comes into that contradiction between profitability and meeting what people need in production.
Oh, I don't know if we lost Rania there. Well,
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted. Yeah.
I am. My end. Can
we
you
have
hear me
you.
now?
We hear you now. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was weird. All right. So to that end, I want to ask you, and this is easier said than done, or obviously, but let's say tomorrow we wake up and we have a socialist economy. How would you fix this under socialism? Because we can sit here and say what's wrong with capitalism, but what should actually be done under the current circumstances?
It seems to me if we're saying that capitalist companies only produce the things that we need, and often produce things we don't need, like arms and advertising and all kinds of things, but even if they produce the things we need only if they make a profit, then what we want is a society where things are produced because that's what the public as a whole, the citizens as a whole, want to meet their needs, whether there's a profit or not. So what we want is public investment. We want state ownership, public ownership of the big industry, big finance companies. The Magnificent Seven should be owned by the federal government, and that they should be broken up and organized through the states to meet the needs of people in those areas. They're big, huge monopolies, which operate on the basis of not in the interest of the majority of the population. We need the big banks. JP Morgan has 70% of the market now. That bank should be a publicly owned bank, democratically run by its workers and organized with the rest of the community to provide what we need. What are banks supposed to provide us? They're supposed to provide us loans that we need to get our homes or to do our businesses and to look after our money, not to speculate on the stock market and destroy half the money, as we've just seen in the last few days. That's not what we want. So we want publicly owned industries and finance sector, democratically run, to produce things that meet people's needs through a plan of public investment. That's what I think we mean by a socialist alternative to what we have now. Now, that's a pretty shocking thing in America. Nobody would agree with that. Virtually nobody would agree with that. Certainly, I don't think any single member of Congress would agree. But until we get in that direction, Americans are going to suffer this situation on a regular basis. And I'm talking about average Americans. And of course, we have a large number of Americans who are poor, whatever happens, something like 10 or 15% in continual level of poverty. Until we change that situation to along the lines sort of that I suggest to you, so we can plan to meet people's needs through public investment, then these continual turmoils will happen, hitting our living standards.
No, absolutely. Well, certainly we are very happy to hear that. And certainly I think there are many watching you here that are going to try to work towards it. And certainly the work you're doing is a North Star for a lot of us in economic analysis. So really thank you for all of that. And I really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the show. Michael Roberts, the Next Recession blog, must read things on a regular basis. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rana.
Well, Eugene,
Yeah.
I guess we'll have to wait and see how all of this pans out. But it does seem like every year, every 2 years, we have to be freaked out about some looming recession. I mean, clearly we're in some sort of capitalist crisis situation at this point because, I mean, the writing on the wall is always like doomsday. And then, something at the last minute sort of saves it briefly. But ultimately, it's like, even if you poll people, they recognize that something ain't right about the future of the economy. And they feel it themselves. Everybody feels like anxious and unsteady. And also in the US, even more so because there's so little security for you to, like, if you fall in the US.
No, it's a good point. I mean, there is the New York Times poll relatively recently, I guess it's a couple months ago now. 69% of people think the economy either needed major changes or to be completely torn down. That was sort of a shocking stat for a lot of people, but I think it speaks to the point you're making. And I was making that point at the time that if you look at the household pulse survey by the U.S. Census, you had 85% of workers basically saying they were having at least a little trouble making their ends meet week to week. And that is just sort of shocking. About a fifth of all workers, 20%, were having very significant trouble making their ends meet week to week. So it gives you a sense of the depth of the social crisis. And yeah, I really appreciate Michael breaking that down. And I really do love the Next Recession blog because he gives you the whole sort of, immediate piece and talks a lot about the immediate economic news, but always ties it back to the sort of deeper undercurrents that this is not random and it's not by accident and it's not just a handful of bad actors, although of course there are many bad actors and unscrupulous people all throughout the capitalist firmament, but really it's the systemic reality of the system that drives you towards crisis and drives you towards destruction. As Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, capitalism creates its own gravediggers because the situation is so bad, for the average person. Really, ultimately, and at least, his prediction would be that people would not take that, and eventually they would change the system to benefit themselves. So, again, we'll have to see how it plays out. You're right, Rania, but interesting and important topics. Well, we want to turn our attention now to something that has made a lot of news this week because of what took place in St. Louis, Missouri on Tuesday evening, the defeat of Cori Bush, and that has put a lot of emphasis on the broader issue that seems to be happening all across the country of AIPAC, and other sort of pro-Israel political action committees and other right-wing organizations, also cryptocurrency PACs, seemingly coming together and really targeting a lot of black politicians in a number of different ways. So anyway, but before I editorialize too much on that, let's just get into it. We are very, very honored to be joined here once again by Davon Love, who's the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Davon, as always, thank you so much for being back with us.
Yep, thanks for having me on.
Well, you had an important piece recently that came out in the Afro, right-wing Democrats and their support for Israel, and prophetic in a way because it was before the Cori Bush thing, but now even more relevant. And I guess I'll just start there. I mean, it feels almost like there's like this unholy alliance that seems to be existing to Jamal Bowman, Cori Bush, and it feels like it's a part of this bigger backlash that has been happening, since 2020 to these huge movements that have arisen, rooted in the black community, trying to push things in a more progressive direction. And I just wonder some of your reflections coming off Cori Bush's loss about where we are in that regard.
Yeah, well, let me start with just a more general reflection, if it's all right, that'll, I think, put my response to that in context.
Please.
Myself and my organization's perspective on the, genocide in Gaza comes from our ideological commitment to solidarity for sovereignty for folks in Palestine, challenging the way in which Israel and its colonial presence in so-called Middle East is an extension of U.S. imperialism. So that's our commitment, our ideological commitment to the issue. But one of the things that I was getting at in the piece that you're referencing is what is the impact of Zionism on the kind of U.S. local political landscape, right? Connecting the two, right? Beyond just the kind of obvious kind of, the things that I just laid out. And for me, one of the things that was important to tie in is that when you think about the expansion of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the backlash to it, that it seems that Zionism, right, and Zionists, folks that have a Zionist perspective, constitute an anchor to the right wing of the Democratic Party, pushing back against the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And it's interesting because, you think about many of the charges of things like anti-Semitism that people deploy against folks that make observations, right, about how those that are avowed Zionists, the nature of their political activity, right? But in many ways, it's so hard to escape the political reality. You think about AIPAC, for instance, and I talked about in the piece that you're referencing, all the money that the millions of dollars that AIPAC, poured into the race against Jamal Bowman, and much of the ads that were ran and much of the propaganda didn't have a whole lot to do with Israel, right? But it was clear that they were supporting a more conservative candidate against Jamal Bowman. And if you look at Cori Bush, who was very outspoken, right, on her position for solidarity of the Palestinian people. But many of the ads and much of the political discourse in her race didn't have much to do with Israel, right? And so to me, it gives even further evidence. And the piece that you're referencing that I write about Maryland, which is where the majority of my work is, one of the interesting things that we're dealing with is that Sinclair Broadcasting, which is a conservative right-wing group, media company that has news stations all over the United States, in Baltimore in particular, but in other places, have been pushing right-wing propaganda against much of the criminal justice reform advocacy that myself and many others have done, right? And one of the things that we notice is that a former chairman of AIPAC, right, Howard Friedman, is on the board, right, of Sinclair Broadcasting, right? And even more so that one of his political proteges is a avowed Zionist city councilman, Yitzi Schleifler, right, for whom he's friends with Howard Friedman's son, who is on the state central committee in the 41st district in Northwest Baltimore. That the state senator of that district, who's a mentor of mine, Senator Joe Carter, has been one of the biggest proponents, right, of criminal justice reform. And they spent all of 2023 attacking her reforms to juvenile justice. The rise in carjackings, and blaming that on Senator Carter, singling her out, or Sinclair Broadcasting. So again, the reason why I go through all that is to say that Zionism has become an ideological anchor beyond just the issue itself of the genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. It has become an ideological anchor for the right wing of the Democratic Party against the expansion of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush are essentially have been targets of that backlash.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting because when we look at, and I'd love for you to expand a bit on what exactly happened with Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush in terms of the amount of money that was spent by groups like AIPAC to unseat them. But what's interesting about the campaigns against them is they weren't necessarily revolving around Israel. There was some of that, but there was also other issues that were thrown into there. Like the people the campaign against them was also against the radical left and their bad policies. So can you talk a little bit about what happened in those cases, the kind of money that was poured into it, and the role that, because we can sit there and blame AIPAC, and AIPAC played a huge role, but right-wing Democrats weren't backing Cori Bush or Jamal Bowman in this case. They were all endorsing the other person.
Well, so what I'll do is I'm going to use the example of Maryland to talk about the state of Maryland to talk about Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush and the question you just asked. Maryland is interesting because it is a Democratic Party stronghold, right? So we have a supermajority in both of our legislative chambers. Now, we had a two-term Republican governor in Larry Hogan, who's more of a moderate Republican as the governor over that course of time. One of the things that we have, though, is even though Maryland would describe itself as progressive, we argue that on many issues that impact Black folks, right, particularly around criminal justice, public safety, anything having to do with community control of public resources, that the Democratic Party is conservative, right, on those issues. And so I would argue that what we see, for instance, in the Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush in those races, and as you mentioned, the issue of Israel and Palestine was not central to the propaganda from AIPAC and all of its affiliates. But what you have is you have Democrats that in some contexts are politically indistinguishable from Republicans, right? And I think that's why you see the overlap in many conservative right-wing donors contributing to AIPAC in Democratic primaries, right? Where you have primaries where what's on the issue, or what is the election is about like how far left a particular political candidate is, right? And so as you mentioned, these right-wing Democrats, a part of what is happening is, I would argue, that the kind of Zionist political networks and anchors that I think at this point we can say is a strong anchor of the right-wing element of the Democratic Party. And so then some of the things that I think those of us that have radical political sensibilities, we have to then identify what are some of the political dog whistles that they deploy, right? Because they don't come out and say, well, Jamal Bowman is about making sure that, Black and brown folks have more opportunities and that there's more, public, access to healthcare and more. And that, that's not the language that they're going to use, right? They're going to use what I describe as like political dog whistles. And what are some of those political dog whistles? Some of those political dog whistles are, they're not effective, right? They're not effective at working with, the Democratic Party. They're not going to be able to bring home things for the district, right? Because they're not in lockstep with the larger Democratic Party establishment, right? Now, they don't say that last part, right, around the Democrats, because we should see that as something that would be good. We value people who are not just going to go along with the company line, right? But the political dog whistle that you heard in both those races is, well, they're not going to be effective at being able to deliver for the Democratic Party. When in fact, you look at, for instance, the vote against the infrastructure package that the Bell campaign used against Cori Bush, I would argue was political leverage that ensured that the infrastructure package went through, right? That it was leverage against the Democratic Party establishment, right? But again, the conservative wing of the Democratic Party, those political dog whistles, the idea is to isolate them, to make them seem as if they're not actually acting in the best interest of the community without concealing what their actual political agenda is.
And one of the questions I'm curious about too, we've mentioned Maryland, and obviously there's a big upcoming Senate race there. Angela also Brooks, former executive of Prince George's County, or maybe current executive still, and also Larry Hogan, of course, former governor, who you just mentioned. And this is an area I think the Republicans are hoping they can make a breakthrough in a Democratic state because Hogan was the governor twice. He's been endorsed by Trump, despite the fact that when Trump was president, they had some disagreements. But I mean, are you expecting, also Brooks to be able to sort of consolidate all Democrats and this maybe won't be a factor? Or is this faction of conservative Democrats perhaps going to flirt with someone like Larry Hogan, and we could see yet again a similar dynamic of trying to use the Zionism as kind of an anchor pulling things to the right in terms of the discourse and the outcome?
Yeah. So, what's interesting is that I mentioned State Senator Bobby Zirkin, who was the chair of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee in the state legislature, who we did battle with on a number of occasions. For instance, one of the initiatives we worked on was pretrial reform, bail reform, right? Making it so that people didn't have to, if they were just charged with a crime, didn't have to spend exorbitant amounts of money to maintain their freedom. And I believe he was either top 3 or the top recipient of campaign contributions from the bail bonds industry when we were fighting him on pretrial, back when he was chair of that committee. He was the author and lead sponsor of a crime bill that expanded sentence enhancements on mandatory minimums, right? So he has a right-wing political agenda, but he is a Democrat, right? He's also Jewish. He is a stated Zionist, and he's a former state senator, but he is now co-chair of Democrats for Hogan. Right now, what's interesting about Zirkin, and then connecting it again to some of the politics here in Maryland, is that there was a important prosecutor race, right, for Baltimore County. Scott Schellenberger, who is the current state's attorney for Baltimore County, who is someone who is a driver of the right-wing agenda in issues of criminal justice. So one of the legislative issues that we worked on with many other organizations was a bill. If your audience has seen When They See Us, the story of this exonerated five, right? Mm-hmm. A bill that would require that parents are notified when a young person's under custodial interrogation and requires an attorney being present, right? And so that was the bill we worked on that got passed in 2022. Schellenberger wants to repeal that, right? Just as an example of the kind of right-wing policies, right? Zirkin backed Schellenberger against a more progressive challenger, right? And he was able to win, right? So Schellenberger was able to beat a more progressive challenger. So I'm giving all of that context because also Brooks herself doesn't have a stellar, progressive record on many of these issues, right? So in some ways, it's strange that there would need to be a consolidation of Democrats to a Republican when there is a Democrat who has not demonstrated a strong affinity to be an advocate on these issues, right? And so I actually do think that Larry Hogan has a chance in this state, given he two-term governor. And and one of the things that Zirkin has said publicly is that his number one issue in the Maryland U.S. Senate race is the stance on Israel. Like he has said that is his number one issue, right? So you have this conservative Democrat former lawmaker, right, who was a part of pushing the party to the right, and Israel being his number one issue that he argues is why he's such a big supporter of Larry Hogan, even though also Brooks is not on the issue of Israel-Palestine, had any particular statements on it. So I think all of that to say that I think in Maryland, if Hogan has a shot at winning the U.S. Senate seat in Maryland, I think it will have in large part to do with the role of conservative Democrats and the ideological anchor of Zionism to provide that additional support that a Larry Hogan would need in a Democratic Party stronghold Maryland to succeed in that race.
Well, very important dynamics to continue to watch in Maryland and all across the country. Really appreciate it. Just want to hope folks go to afro.com and check out your piece, Right-Wing Democrats and Their Support for Israel. You are Davon Love, the Director of Public Policy at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. As always, my brother, appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Yep, thanks for having me. Y'all take care.
Rania?
No, this party is just... This point, it makes sense that all this is happening because of who funds the party. It is a corporate-funded party, one of two parties that basically function as like a political dictatorship over the country. I just don't think it's redeemable at this point. But lots to say about that in the coming weeks. But Eugene, it's unbelievable. It's really, really unbelievable how, despite the fact that the majority of the base of the Democratic Party not only wants a ceasefire, but actually, I believe, sees this as a genocide. Yet the leadership of this party is still, the head of the U.S., the president right now, is like supporting unconditionally Israel's slaughter in Gaza, and his vice president, who's now the presidential candidate for 2024, is refusing to change course, as far as I can tell so far.
Yeah, no, it certainly seems to be the case. And we saw that, the White House actually took a shot at Cori Bush, who, of course, in her speech after her loss, said that she was going to do everything she could to challenge this, consensus being created by AIPAC and others who are working with them, this Fair Shake PAC, which is cryptocurrencies and others, that she was going to, fight back. So we're going to tear down your kingdom. And amazingly, the White House said that she was wrong to have targeted them. It was really just said the cravenness of it was honestly shocking, but it said so much because they didn't do anything to help her whatsoever. Neither did the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee that allegedly is always supposed to help incumbents. They were, MIA. They were MIA on the Jamal Bowman thing, except for a handful of, paper endorsements. So obviously they don't want these people in there. There's critiques we can make of all these people, I'm sure, maybe there's some people making them in the chat, but nonetheless, it's clear that they're seen as a big problem by the leadership of the Democratic Party, the Jamal Bowmans, the Cory Bushes of the world, and they want them out of there. And I think it's because they feel they're not fully controllable to the super pro-capitalist corporate agenda. So nonetheless, we'll have to keep watching this very interesting Senate race there in Maryland too, and determine a lot in terms of the political scene next year. So big thanks to LBS for bringing that to our attention. Next, we want to turn our attention to, a range of different issues that are all, of course, circulating around the center of gravity of the genocide in Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show to discuss this by Layan Sima Fuleihan, who is the education director at the People's Forum and also an editor at 1804 Books. Layan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, the thanks go to you. Our pleasure to have you here. I guess I'll just start with this. I mean, I'm looking at the headline at Al Jazeera right now, at least 15 killed, 30 wounded in Israeli bombing of 2 schools in Gaza. So, I mean, we have so much discussion in sort of the U.S. political sphere about the issue of a ceasefire. Is it coming? Is it coming soon? So on and so forth. But it seems to me that, honestly, the broader sort of Israeli attitude here, Layan, is to keep pushing this genocide without end. It doesn't really seem like there is any political will there to do much of anything. Am I off base?
I don't think you're off base. I mean, if we look at the timeline of events, July 24, Netanyahu came for his very controversial visit to a joint session of Congress. That visit was marred by outcry both outside the Capitol and in the weeks leading up to it, and then went back to Israel. And then quite soon after, we had 2 major assassinations of leadership in Hezbollah and Hamas. So he came to his visit where Biden supposedly was supposed to put pressure on him kind of agreeing to finally a ceasefire deal, and instead he turns around and goes back, and with or without the green light from the United States, we're not certain about that, but certainly the United States has not done very much to stop him, puts a major bet on the table by carrying out these very high-profile political assassinations that put the entire region at risk for an outbreak of regional war. So it certainly doesn't seem like Israel is interested in de-escalation, not interested in winding down the genocide. In the past weeks, there's been multiple bombings of schools, of so-called safe zones. The images, the reality on the ground in Gaza is just horrific from these attacks. It's not winding down in any way, shape, or form, despite the fact that Israel is still no closer to achieving any of its military goals.
So I think it's also interesting that this is all happening with this sort of backdrop of the upcoming U.S. elections. And we had, Joe Biden basically step down. He's not going to be the nominee. Now we have Kamala Harris being anointed the Democratic candidate. And there's been a lot of talk about, especially from people who are anti-genocide, that, maybe Kamala will be movable on this issue because she's, made some statements where she basically acknowledges Palestinian suffering in a way Joe Biden hasn't. But it seems pretty clear to me, at least, that as far as her policy position goes, she has stated nothing that suggests that she will do anything different than what Joe Biden does, and that is ongoing unconditional support for Israel. And I mean, just last night, and I'm sure a lot of people who are tuning in right now may have seen this clip. We saw there was Kamala Harris was giving a speech in Michigan at a campaign event, and she was disrupted by pro-Palestine protesters. And she reacted in a really horribly condescending, rude way. Let's, if we can, please play that clip.
You know what?
Because Layan, I'd like to get your reaction to it.
If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. Otherwise, I'm speaking.
That glare. And, now it's like her campaign, or at least some of her supporters, are trying to be like, oh, she's so badass. Look at that glare. When, these are people who have lost hundreds of their family members Gaza. And yes, they're interrupting her speech because she is the sitting vice president of the US. There's blood on her hands. Sorry, I'm opining here, Layan, but what's your response, A, to her reaction to a protest at one of her campaign events in Michigan, of all places? And then B, how do you respond to people that are like, no, we have to wait and see because Kamala might be movable. Maybe we should support her.
Well, I actually don't think you're opining. I think you're stating the facts. The fact is that she is the current administration, which is carrying out the genocide against the Palestinian people. And the second fact that's important to note is that we don't know what her political program is, actually. If you go on her website, there is no political program. There's nothing actually there's nothing concrete for anyone to actually look at that would suggest any change, whether it's favorable or not favorable to the Palestinian people in Kamala Harris administration. And all we have to go off of actually is the fact that she is the current administration. We're in a Biden-Harris administration, and it's under this administration that the genocide has been carried out. For her to react that way, for me personally, I'm not surprised. And I think it shows very clearly the approach that this campaign is going to take. Palestine has been the biggest political crisis for the Democrats. I mean, it has really destroyed a lot of the Democratic base that they usually can count on. And so the move here seems to me to be to say, listen, if you're for Palestine, don't attack us because Trump is worse. And if you're for Palestine, let's make sure Trump can't get into office. It's another way of kind of trying to avoid the topic. She's not actually commenting necessarily. There's nothing actually that we can refer to that would really give us an idea that she could be movable or not. And I think it's important that we remind everyone and remind ourselves what we have actually to show for is the fact that she is part of this current administration. We haven't seen any sort of policy proposals. We haven't seen her in action. We actually saw a tweet from her team that said under no circumstances would she consider an arms embargo to Israel, and that in fact she is 100% backing Israel's right to self-defense, and that the U.S. would be part of that self-defense. So, it's not a surprise. I think this is going to be one of the maneuvers that the Democratic Party makes to try to get itself out of the trap it's created for itself by not listening to their own constituents' demands around Palestine.
No, I think that's a really important point. And, the other element of this, that tweet that you just referenced there, from her advisor or whatever, saying that she'll stand up to these Iran and Iran-backed groups or whatever the exact phrasing was. But the thing that caught me about that exact phrasing is that's essentially the exact same thing that Benjamin Netanyahu was saying in front of the joint session of Congress, that it's all really about Iran. This is like a plot of Iran against the whole region and against, all that's holy, good, and right in the world, of course, because they're all that's dark, evil, and whatever. I mean, that kind of ridiculous framing by Netanyahu. But it's not that ridiculous because obviously, Israel seems to be going out of its way to inflame tensions with Iran, with other groups in the region from Hezbollah, and to create this sort of good versus evil regional war to, it seems to me, try to reset the stage almost in terms of the narrative of what's happening, even though, of course, it'll mean more death and more destruction. So, I mean, there's no real way to know, I guess, so I'm asking you to maybe just generally speak to it. But it does feel like this is a big strategy of those who are really backing Israel, is to try to create this broader regional polarization centered on Iran, to try to take the issue off of the genocide in Gaza, which is obviously the proximate cause of everything happening.
That's definitely true. And I think it's super complex. It's hard to know what's going to come next. Israel and the United States are extremely nervous, extremely anxious right now. If you look at some of the news and the activity of the State Department and some of the reports on the kind of back channel messaging that's been going on from the State Department to Iran and other states in the region, the U.S. is really quite nervous about the possibility of a regional war. And why wouldn't they be? I mean, there's been no successful war that the United States has carried out in the region for decades. And they tried everything they could to try to put some sort of, tie the bow on the current genocide in Gaza in some way to allow them to move to the so-called day after plan. Now, Israel made a gamble here, and again, we don't know how much the United States supported or didn't support this move, but either way, they are not wavering in their support of Israel. So, in essence, they support the move, made a big gamble with these assassinations. And the assassination of Haniyeh in particular was a huge gamble, and on the territory of Iran as well, in Tehran, is a huge gamble. The response of Hamas has been actually to show greater unity and to appoint Sinwar as the new head of the political bureau. And this is causing Israel to feel very nervous. I mean, if you look at the media coming from the Israeli side, people are really quite anxious. There's a psychological element to all of this. If the assassinations were an attempt to create any sort of deterrence, to create any sort of weakness among the resistance forces in the region, whether it's trying to put strain on the relationship between Hamas and Iran, or between Hamas and the so-called axis of resistance, or to create any sort of internal tension for Hamas by taking out the lead negotiator, who is outside of Gaza. All of those things have failed. I mean, right now it is Israel and the United States who are suffering the consequences of this tension because they are waiting on pins and needles. The ball is kind of in Iran's court and Hezbollah's court, and they're taking their time with it. They're saying, we will respond. We'll respond the way that we see fit, and we'll respond when we see that it's the right moment. It's totally putting the balance of forces has changed completely. And it seems, in a sense, that the U.S. and Israel are in many ways at a disadvantage, even though they are militarily, of course, wealthier, stronger objectively. But this gamble that they took has turned the tables and is now putting them on the side of not knowing what's next, and full of anxiety, not just for those who are in charge of the military establishment, but for the entire population of Israel as well.
Yeah, it's really amazing to just watch how quickly, even though Israel's the obvious aggressor, I mean, they carried out a murder of the head of the ceasefire negotiation team in Iran, in a sovereign country, in Tehran, Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas. And then, of course, they killed the high-level Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in the southern suburb Dahia of Beirut, which is a huge act of escalation. And then you have these Western diplomats rushing over to anybody they can talk to, who can talk to the Iranians and to Hezbollah, being like, just absorb the blow and don't hit back. And then basically framing any retaliation for these obvious crimes of aggression as terrorism. It's just unbelievable to watch, but I guess it's par for the course. But Layan, as we do await this, this Iranian response that is supposed to, come at some point, and of course there's a psychological sort of, warfare element, the fact that it hasn't come yet. I'm just curious, when we talk about, a potential regional war, do you think, as somebody who's been involved in organizing people and protesting constantly against the genocide in Gaza, I mean, do you think there's a level of fatigue happening around this that, or do you think we'd see an even bigger outpouring of, antagonism towards a potential bigger war that the Israelis are clearly trying to drag the U.S. into? And honestly, I don't even know if we should be saying the Israelis trying to drag the U.S., because there are elements of the American ruling class that would love to go to war with Iran.
Well, that's totally true. On that last point, I think that's extremely important to note. The United States is not totally unified on their approach on strategy, nor are they unified with the Israelis, nor is the Israeli establishment unified either. I mean, there's all sorts of different proposals that are coming out from different voices about what's the best route to conquer Gaza, and they're not agreed on this necessarily. But of course, that doesn't mean that they don't feel unity around the project of imperialism in the Arab region. And that's what they're unified on. I mean, the United States still has, there was an Intercept report that came out a few days ago, I think, that showed at least 64 U.S. bases, but a lot of them are secret, or military sites. A lot of them are secret, and so those are what they could uncover. The U.S. still has huge military presence, at least 43,000 troops, I believe, if not more, again, because a lot of the operations and presence is classified or secret. And so it's not like the United States is so unwilling to be there. They've reinforced with more troops in the past 2 weeks. They're making every indication that if regional war does break out, which again, like you said, Rania, the major force that's been escalating has been the Israelis, the U.S. and the Israelis, not the other regional actors, who have been very strategic and actually have showed quite a bit of restraint given the amount of incursions on their sovereignty and attacks that they have been facing. And so on your first question on how the movement would respond to this, I think again and again, the United States has underestimated the level of consciousness of people around the world. Now, it's been almost 10 months of constant genocide, and on the other side of the coin, constant mobilizations against the genocide. Yes, things are going to shift. They're going to go up and down. But what has consistently gone up has been the political consciousness of masses of people who have been participating in this movement. Now, people are no longer going to fall for the whole Iran is bad and everyone else is good scenario. I mean, the process of watching the genocide unfold, of watching the United States justify again and again a genocide, and then the complicity of the entire U.S. system be exposed, has changed the balance of forces for the U.S. to be able to convince its own population of its agenda. I don't think that there will be any less response to a regional war than there is for the genocide, and in fact, possibly more, because people have now their own understanding of the U.S.'s role in the world has completely changed, and the legitimacy of the White House's narrative around who is on the good side of history and who's on the bad side of history has completely been thrown away. And on top of it, if we, outside of the movement, the U.S. has lost a lot of legitimacy in the international arena as well. Even Saudi Arabia is saying that Iran deserves sovereignty and that this assassination was a violation of its sovereignty. A lot of the number one partners of the United States are not indicating that they are in favor of an all-out war along these lines that have been drawn by Israel and the United States. So a regional war, I think, would present a lot more complications for the United States, not just militarily, not just in the arena of geopolitics, but also in the arena of public opinion and its domestic policies. It's no longer so simple to say Iran is bad, we need to defend ourselves from Iran. The whole calculation has changed here, and a new regional war that would implicate more of U.S. resources and that would take more lives from the people across the region, I think would not be accepted by the masses of people in the United States and would create a new political crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to keep watching and a lot to keep following. And as always, we appreciate having you on here, Layan, to help us sort through it all. Layan Fuleihan, Education Director at the People's Forum and editor at 1804 Books. As always, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you both so much for having me.
Well, Eugene, as we wait for this looming Iranian response, one thing that is clear is that it's quite the balance that Israel's enemies have to play, because, Israel wants to create a situation where there's a regional war, but actually those that are labeled terrorists do not want a regional war. And if anything, they behave as the adults in the room when it comes to this. So they're always put in this difficult position of having to respond to these acts of aggression, because Israel's a bully. If you don't if they see it as, if we don't respond, this is what they say, if we don't respond, then the Israelis will think it's like open season to come do whatever they want, because they're not going to get a response. So they feel they need to respond, but at the same time, they need to calculate this response not to provoke, a volcanic eruption of a regional war. It's a very difficult place to be repeatedly placed in since October 7th. And repeatedly, Israel has carried out these massive escalations outside of the so-called rules of engagement to try to provoke, something that will make the U.S. get more involved. And each time we've seen the resistance acts as actors, operate within these very difficult confines of balancing. And so it stands to be seen what they're going to do this time around. But one thing is clear, if you've listened to Hassan Nasrallah's speeches and seen the rhetoric coming from Iranian officials, they reserve the full right to respond very forcefully. So we'll see what happens.
We will indeed. We will indeed. Well, we are going to move to another hot button issue here, and that is the ongoing controversy, if you will, over what the outcome of the Venezuelan election was. Of course, you were there, Rania, and I think people who follow Breakthrough News know you were there. One of the people you were there alongside with over the election period is Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, who is joining us now to get more into everything happening around this. Zoe, as always, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I think there's a lot to say and a lot of context to be had here and to get into, but I want to start with a story that kind of broke today that I think is also important for framing, a number of other opposition parties, so people who ran against Nicolas Maduro and the United Socialist Party, have raised some claims about the main opposition party's claims of having won the election. Now, of course, we don't have to get into all the details necessarily to adjudicate it, but I think what's important about this, Zoe, and what I was hoping you could speak to is, in the U.S. narrative, it's like being presented as if there is, it's known. There's no other narrative. Maduro lost, he stole the election, everything's fake, and the opposition has presented evidence that proves that it was all faked and stolen, so that's what you should believe. But it seems like now, not only is obviously the PSUV disputing that, but now even other opponents of them are disputing that. So maybe just speak to that framing, because I think in terms of how people are following this crisis, it's important to know that there is some dispute here.
Yeah, it's very interesting what the U.S. government and mainstream media in the United States chooses to believe as the ultimate fact, because essentially what you're referring to here right now, Eugene, is that one of the opposition candidates, Daniel Ceballos, gave declarations to the media today where he essentially said, how am I going to believe and give importance to a website that has no transparency? And what he's talking about is that the opposition, on July 28th, as people are, waiting at the edge of their seats for their results from the, official electoral body of Venezuela, which is the National Electoral Council. The opposition, again, is drumming up rumors of fraud, all this stuff. And, after the CNE announces the results, the opposition says these are not true, and we're going to show you why. And so thus begins this whole journey of them saying that we have the paper tallies, that we were in every single precinct, and we not only have them, but we're going to upload them to a website, which is the official website that actually has the truth about the Venezuelan election. So what's important to know here is that, one, I don't know if in the United States, if a random party decided that they were going to create their own private website run by people in the party with essentially kind of paper tickets that there's no way of knowing if those are actually verified or not, putting those on a website and then saying, see, this is why the actual results are 70 to 30%. Many different, and so they created this website. Essentially what happens, you go to the website, it's like VenezuelanResults.org, I forget the exact URL, and if you're a foreigner, you actually can't really go much further than seeing that there is a website and that you have to put in your ID number. If you're Venezuelan, you put in your ID number and allegedly the paper tally from your precinct appears. However, since the website was launched, I think it was last week, many different analysts and researchers have gone through this website. They've put in, for example, the ID numbers of people who are already deceased, and somehow the paper tallies have come up. So there's a lot of evidence pointing to the fact that what is on this website, the paper tallies which the opposition claims to have, really might not be the most convincing and verified set of evidence. And they're essentially positing their entire claim that Edmundo Gonzalez won the elections with 70% of the votes, Maduro with 30% of the votes, on this website and on the evidence they've put up there. I saw yesterday that someone even put the ID number of Nicolas Maduro, and apparently he didn't vote in the election. So, there's a lot of controversy over this website, over the alleged, crystal clear results that they have. And I think that what's really important, when you hear, for example, the New York Times analysis saying that this evidence suggests that Edmundo Gonzalez won in a landslide, that this evidence isn't as rock hard as they want you to believe that it is.
Zoe, we know that the U.S. government has officially recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as the winner. But very briefly, I mean, for those who maybe aren't familiar with it or forgot about it, this is not the first time the U.S. has done this. In fact, I have to say, the U.S. seems a bit, lazy in its approach this time around, because it's literally just repeating the same exact script as what took place 6 years ago with Juan Guaido. So can you talk about very briefly the situation that took place back then? And I think it's important to recognize the U.S. has done this before in the not too distant past, because it kind of gives us an idea of what it means for Venezuela to have the United States government recognizing a loser, the person who lost, or anybody else as the legitimate president of Venezuela, and what that might mean going forward.
Yeah, Rania, that's a crucial question, because, why recognize Edmundo Gonzalez when not only the majority of the opposition candidates, the majority of the country, believe in their electoral authority, believe that Nicolas Maduro won. It was a close race, 51%, but in the end, he won the elections. What does it mean for the U.S. to recognize him? It is a retired formula. That's exactly right. This is essentially a repeat with some different characteristics of Juan Guaido 2019, who was an opposition assemblyman, relatively unknown, and essentially one day in January 2019, surely in dialogue with some of his friends from good old United States, essentially proclaimed that he was president of Venezuela. He was the interim president because all of the other elections that had been held since 2015 were illegitimate, and that the only recognized authority should be the person who is in charge of the, at the time, defunct National Assembly. Juan Guaido goes to a public plaza. He tries to rally up thousands of people, and he says, "I swear that I am the rightful president of Venezuela." People kind of laugh at this because it's sort of a ridiculous claim to make, especially when the person sitting in Miraflores Plaza is Nicolas Maduro, the person running the country is Nicolas Maduro, the person, managing the day-to-day affairs of the Venezuelan people, society, state is Nicolas Maduro. But what follows this is, as you said, the recognition by Donald Trump at the time of Juan Guaido as the constitutional and legitimate leader of Venezuela. And this sets off kind of a wave of other regional leaders recognizing him, people in Latin America, European countries. And this essentially paves the way for the United States and countries in Europe to seize Venezuela's assets and to impose a new series of extremely restrictive, unilateral, coercive measures on Venezuela's economy, on its oil sector, and to essentially squeeze a country that was already reeling under massive sanctions on its oil sector that were imposed in 2017 and 2018. This essentially tightens that nail and also steals Venezuelan money. So we have over $8 billion in Venezuelan assets that are seized from one day to the next because the U.S. and their friends unilaterally decide to recognize this largely unknown member of Venezuela's National Assembly as president. And so I think that's so important when we're looking at the U.S. recognition of Edmundo Gonzalez as the alleged winner of these elections, that it's not just U.S. being contrarian, it's not them trying to say, just to say Nicolas Maduro didn't win, but it actually has nefarious economic interests. We saw that Seco was seized in this process. There was a very important petrochemical company in Colombia, which was also seized, which is Monumeros. Important to point out, once Gustavo Petro won in Colombia, that company was actually given back to its rightful owners, which is Venezuela. So this has enormous impact on Venezuela's ability to recover economically and have control over its actual money and reserves.
No, I think that's a critically important point. And, it also, the Montemero situation helped Colombia's recovery, as Petro pointed out when people were criticizing him, saying that the operation of the company was helping them keep down the inflation for small farmers in buying fertilizers. But, I'm glad you mentioned the ties to the United States and the long history of the Venezuelan right, because there's an interesting aspect to this. And there's been a lot of reporting on this. One recent article I saw that was interesting about it is one by Brian Meir in Counterpunch recently, Election Theater in Venezuela, a tale from Election Day in Caracas, where he was on the day. But he talks about being at the Andres Bello precinct right at the end, and how, they actually kept the poll open a little bit later, so some elderly people, others could actually vote. Seemed like everyone had voted. The election time is over, just like every other country. At a certain point, you can no longer vote. And that as soon as the polls closed, just several minutes after, all of a sudden there were hundreds of people who were rushing the door, banging on the door, saying, "Let us vote." There were all sorts of other, I don't even know what to call them, streamers and others. There was Channel 13 from Argentina, affiliated with Javier Milei, running around asking people, "Why won't Nicolas Maduro let you vote?" And, I'm taking this, he doesn't say this, but the implication being that this was already kind of set up. And we can remember, of course, the opposition said that they'll only accept the results if they win. So it almost feels like there's kind of a, thinking of the Trump-Guaido connection, like a stop the steal kind of narrative, similar to what Trump did, similar to what Bolsonaro did, where it almost seems like there was a pre-planned situation to cast doubt on the vote.
Yeah, definitely. And I was in Brazil for the 2022 elections, and something that myself and many other people, I'm sure Brian Meir as well, documented is that in the years leading up to the 2022 elections, essentially Bolsonaro had been paving the way to create this fraud narrative after the elections. He himself held a meeting with ambassadors of several countries. I think it was over 30 countries, to essentially say it was in August and the elections were going to happen end of September and end of October. And he said the electronic voting system that we have in Brazil is unreliable and there's going to be fraud. I think that this system should be taken away, and anything that happens under this system is fraudulent. That's exactly what the Venezuelan opposition did. Since day one, they have, well, first of all, they haven't recognized any electoral process since 2015. The far right opposition has refused to participate in the many, since 2015, there's been at least 10 different elections that have taken place. They've boycotted them. So there's already a narrative amongst sectors of this far right opposition that any time voting happens in Venezuela is going to be fraudulent. They, ahead of these elections, as you said, there were 10 presidential candidates in these elections. 9 of them signed an agreement saying that they would respect the results of the election. The one that did not sign this agreement was Edmundo Gonzalez. So already, they're saying that they're participating, but in what? Really, how are they participating? Because they say that they won't respect the results. And then as soon as the elections are over, they somehow have this entire system that gives a completely different outcome. And then if you look at, all sorts of mainstream media ahead of the elections, whether it's New York Times, whether it's Infobae in Argentina, Telemundo, all of these outlets, the headline will be something like, Maduro set to lose in elections that are riddled with fraud. They'll always mention fraud. They'll always mention doubt over the electoral system. A lot of these scripts seem to be pre-written before the elections. Everything they're saying during the elections is sort of orchestrated, rehearsed. And then exactly after the elections, it's sort of like they have those tweets ready, they have that discourse ready, because this is exactly what they're planning for, to say, There's no way that elections in these conditions can be respected. For example, Edmundo Gonzalez refused to go to the Supreme Court because he said that's a compromised authority. So if you're already saying every single body of power, including the electoral power, which is an autonomous power in the Venezuelan government, the Supreme Court, are all compromised, then what authority do you respect? Do you actually believe that electoral process can happen? They use the elections to create this chaos, to create doubt, to create, again, polarization in society. And the people are actually very tired of that because they just want to live in peace. They want to recover their economy. They want to get out from underneath these sanctions. But the far right just uses every single opportunity, and especially elections, to drum up mistrust, to drum up international stigmatization, and all of these other things which only hurt the people.
No, well, all critically important points. I mean, there's so much to say here. Just before I let you go, Zoe, I just have to ask you this because you were there on the ground. I mean, what were your impressions on Election Day?
I mean, it was a very peaceful process. I was going around to different precincts in the afternoon. It was funny because I was driving to one precinct and reading a New York Times article that said, extremely long lines make it impossible for Venezuelan people to participate in the elections. Many reports of irregularities. And I head to this precinct, and as a journalist, you want to get pictures that you can later use in your articles of many people lining up, going to vote. And we went to a bunch of different voting stations. There were a few people going to vote. It seems like most people had gone in the morning because that's usually how people plan their day, go in the morning, relax in the afternoon. And that's basically what we saw. Old people, young people headed to the polls in a leisurely way, exercising their right to vote. It's a very quick process. You go in, it's an electronic machine, you show your ID card, you vote, and that's pretty much it. Again, I was only in a couple places in Caracas, but I know that there were electoral witnesses all over the country who reported a lot of similar things. We actually ran into a UN specialist who was part of a technical team observing the elections, and he said, all I can see is that it's been a pretty peaceful day, pretty calm, people able to vote. So that was pretty much what I saw. That was what other people saw. They try to make it out to seem like some chaos, irregularity-filled day, but it is just these media narratives that they're trying to push a certain interpretation of the events.
Well, thankfully, we have People's Dispatch to help us sort through it all. Sorry, Rania, I cut you off there.
No. I was just, I agree with everything Zoe said. I was there on that day too. And it's in keeping with what I saw as well. So please continue. But I endorse what you're saying about People's Dispatch, by the way, as well.
Well, thank God we're on the same page about that. We'd really be in trouble. That'd be the real recount that we'd need here. But of course, fantastic work. People's Dispatch covering all of this. Vijay Prashad as well published some pieces from his experiences there during the election. Zoe Alexandra, you are the co-editor of People's Dispatch. Thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Rania.
Well, I mean, Eugene, I recently had someone look me in the eye and go, but isn't there a lot of opposition to Maduro in Venezuela? And I'm just like, I don't even know how to deal with people anymore. Like, I'm just like, leave Venezuela. Like, you're American. Deal with your own country. Like, leave Venezuela alone. Why is it your business? Why is it your business what's happening in all these other countries that happen to be sitting on top of a lot of oil? It's not your business. Focus on your own country and leave Venezuela alone. That's my message.
Well, it's a good message. Doubt it will be heated in the White House, but perhaps you will prevail upon them. But I agree with you 100% there. It's the massive meddling from the United States. But if anybody else, gets a hangnail, they're meddling in the U.S. election. But yeah, we'll have to see. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this turns. The fact that a number of other opposition forces have now started casting doubt on Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado's. That adds a new wrinkle to the whole story. So it'll be very interesting to see how this play out, and we will continue to cover it and bring you whatever you need to know here vis-a-vis this ongoing issue, which will have great importance, of course, for Latin America. Just before we close, Rania, that's the end of our guest, but thought it was important, and we'll also continue to try to follow this story very closely, to say a little something about Bangladesh, which obviously is going through significant transition now. Longtime Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was forced to step down several days ago by huge mass student-led protests that have been taking place. Over 400 people, I believe it was over 400 people. Let me double check that so I don't get that wrong. Were killed in the context of these protests that took place. There are a number of arrests. There's a very harrowing situation there, and now there is an interim government led by Mr. Mohammed Yunus, who many people might know for his Grameen Bank and microloans, and we'll come back to all of that. But it's obviously a critically important issue. I mean, Bangladesh is a huge country. It's 171 million people, if I have that right, which is one of the largest countries on earth. I think it might be 8 or 9. I can't remember off the top of my head. Obviously, it's in a critically important part of the world. South Asia, of course, it's part of the Indian subcontinent, but Bangladesh also, in many ways, with a lot of similarities to the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia as well. And this is the main arena, of course, for geopolitical confrontation right now, as the United States is forming this new Cold War with China. It's also an area that is one of the centers of the developing world and the areas of the world that are looking to rise up out of their traditional poverty that's enforced from many years of colonialism. Of course, Bangladesh, like the rest of the subcontinent, was colonized for hundreds of years by the British as well, and an attempt to move forward, move beyond that, and a desire for people to have a significantly better life and to not be permanently subordinate. So there are so many critically important issues that I think are nested in Bangladesh in the context of what's happening there, and I think that's why it's so important and as a story, and one that it's not really making huge headlines in the United States, although it's big in many other parts of the world, especially in Asia, but one that I think is worth paying attention to, because I think it hits on so many of the critical undercurrents sweeping the world about what the future is really going to be, what it can look like, and certainly what it can look like if it's going to be positive for working class people and others. And I think there's a few points. I mean, the start of the protest, of course, was around, what was known as the quota reform movement. That was against elements of how opportunities for higher education were being parceled out to certain elements of the community. And, the context for that, and an important context for that, right, is that you have tens of millions of young people who have no jobs, and in the jobs that are available tend to be, very low wage jobs, many of them, of course, centered on the sort of infamous, if you will, garment, some would say sweatshop sector in Bangladesh, similar to other Southeast Asian countries. And so the desire for more opportunity, and there's a paradox to it in a way, because, of course, Bangladesh is a country, through inserting itself into the capitalist world economy in this particular role as a assembly type situation, was able to have some gains, infrastructure, reductions in poverty in a more general sense, but had really reached an inflection point where there was, things had leveled out and the opportunities for people were growing smaller, but there's still a huge amount of economic growth and potential there. And so how are access to opportunity going to be parceled out? And there is many different elements here that went along with it. And of course, some quotas for the poor, for women, those are good, but there is a lot of controversy over one element of it, which was, a 30% quota for veterans, or really the families of veterans of the 1971 Liberation War. And a lot of people felt that was just sort of a narrow party-based thing for the ruling party, which has its roots in that war in 1971 that liberated Bangladesh from Pakistan. It was a part of Pakistan up until then, and they wanted more opportunity, because obviously there's different challenges there. Now, of course, that then led to a much deeper piece, and I don't want to say a whole long thing about this, but I do think it's an interesting conversation, because there's quite a bit of discussion about what needs to come next in Bangladesh. And I think many people are saying they want to see more social justice. They want to see more shared access to the opportunity of economic growth. They want to move beyond just being sort of a sweatshop-based country and maybe have a broader, more expanded, more developed economy. And I think those are all laudable goals. I think that's basically where so much of the developing world is right now. But the challenge that you have is, how do you do that in the context of world US-led imperialism that wants countries like Bangladesh or every country in Africa and India and Indonesia to only serve a very particularistic role as places to extract value from, but not places that are deserving of development and a good life for all. And I think it raises a lot of questions about what happens next. I mean, Mohammed Yunus, who I mentioned, who's the interim prime minister, he was hailed by the imperialist West for these microloans, which, were supposed to change the whole situation for poor women, especially in Bangladesh. That did not happen. In fact, the whole microloan scheme, just continued to trap poor people in rural areas and in cycles of debt that was not transformative at all. And when you look at some of the people like Hillary Clinton and others who have been some of his biggest proponents, it raises a lot of questions about whether or not a person like that, I certainly think it's highly unlikely, given his own history, is going to be someone who's going to back transformative economic change. And also, I would also add that the main opposition parties that are making a big play now, the BNP, Jamaat-e-Islam, they are for more privatization, for more marketization, for more impact of Western investment, that it will make the situations that people are raising in terms of economic deprivation in Bangladesh even worse. So I think we're in an interesting context here. And also, I'll just add to that quickly, and then I'll come to a close. And if you have thoughts, I'm happy to put it in. Bangladesh, whatever critiques you can make out of it, rejected being a part of the Quad, the U.S. attempt to rope in various countries into their attempt to encircle China in the new Cold War. They rejected a base that would be used to sort of project against China. So they were trying to stay out of this new Cold War scenario. They didn't want to be drawn into it. Obviously, they work with the U.S. They were working with the U.S., the Awami League. They were working with China. They're working with India. Like a lot of countries, especially in Southeast Asia, this is also true in Africa, people are not trying to be drawn into this Cold War scenario. But there are many attempts, and have been many attempts, to push Bangladesh over the edge here. So in addition to many of these political forces having right-wing, neoliberal economic agendas, you have to also ask, will they also acquiesce to this imperial agenda geopolitically, which also will help hobble the economy, because there is no growth in Asia without cooperation between all the Asian countries with China. I think anyone who knows anything recognizes that that is in fact the case. So I think we're in a situation that, it reminds me a little bit of the Arab Spring. I know there are some people who are pushing back against that, but where people are raising many very legitimate points and grievances. They went out in very brave ways to assert their rights around many of these legitimate points and grievances. But the reality is nature abhors a vacuum. And sometimes when you're against something, what comes after it isn't what you expect. And I think that there is a huge space here that is going to be exploited by the United States to try to use this opportunity of what's happening in Bangladesh. And this is something similar to what happened in Sri Lanka, by the way, too, when the government there was overthrown and Mr. Rajapaksa, of trying to use this moment of transition when people are desperate for change to exploit that moment to actually install governments that are not going to bring any more change, but actually make things worse, but ultimately acquiesce to a geopolitical agenda that will be better for the United States. So I think it's important to be on guard there in that regard. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to be said. I think there will be more to be had out there. I thought Vijay Prashad had a good article at People's Dispatch, which we just were talking to their co-editor recently about all of this. I encourage people to check out. But a lot to watch there. Very important place, very important country in the sort of broader scheme of where this world is going to go in the second half of the 21st century. These kind of battles and these sorts of middle developing countries, I think, are going to play a huge role in shaping the world, as it were. So sorry to go on for a little bit there, Rania, but did just want to mention that given the significance of what's been happening there this week.
No, Eugene, I really appreciate that. And it's definitely a story we're going to continue to follow here at Breakthrough News. So keep your eye out. And on that note, I think we had a really fantastic show. We always do.
Yes, we do.
But I'll let you do the sign off because you're always really good at that. But I guess before you do, I should say.
Please.
I'll just go ahead and do my part, which is to remind everybody to make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm.
Smash that like button.
Love it. And then more importantly, if you are able, if you have the means, please do consider becoming a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. We are an independent media outlet, and we are able to continue to exist and grow because of your support. Because you know who's not supporting us? Time Warner. That's who I think is CNN's funder. So please do consider becoming a member. You can help support independent media and also help us grow. And you can also access exclusive content and merch. You can go check out patreon.com/breakthrough news to find out the details on that.
Well, great job, Rania. Glad you did your part. I'd hate to be accused of stolen valor here at the end of the show, but that will bring us here to the end of the show. Big thanks to all of our guests. Of course, big thanks to all of you who are our viewers. Big thanks to all of our patrons as well. All of your work is critically important to keeping us going. Shout out to our friends at Free Speech TV for helping us appear there. That'll do it for us here for this episode of The Freedom Side. But for myself, for Rania, for the whole BT team, we will see you next time.